Welcome back to our study in the book of Genesis. We're looking at Genesis chapter 21 and 22. We're looking at Isaac. Patriarchal age, Isaac, Genesis 21 to 27. Birth of Isaac, sacrifice of Isaac. Almost two nations in Rebekah. Promise to Isaac, and Isaac blesses Jacob. Terah's family tree. Just as God promised, Abraham and Sarah had a son. Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. Isaac was circumcised on the 8th day. There was a great feast at Isaac's weaning. Isaac mocks God's plan for Ishmael. Abraham sends Hagar and Ishmael away. God rescues Hagar and Ishmael. So Isaac and his parents, circumcised by his father, protected by his mother, submissive to his father, heir of Abraham's estate. Yahweh treated Sarah as he said and did what he had promised to her. Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time God had promised. So the birth of Isaac, the events can be seen in three different dimensions. We see a divine dimension in the birth of the son as a gift from God. 21:3-5 records the response of Abraham to the birth of his son. And finally, the jubilance of Sarah over the arrival of the long-awaited child who is the joy of her life. An act of God. If we were to speak to an insurance agent, he would quickly tell us that an act of God in his line of work is a disaster over which man has no control. Isaac was an act of God in a very different sense. He was a result of divine intervention in the lives of Abraham and Sarah, both of whom were too old to bear children. It was a fulfillment of a promise made long before the birth of the child and often reiterated to Abraham. Several things are striking about this passage. First, we cannot miss the note of calm assurance. There has been no suspense. The event comes without surprise, reported as though nothing else could have happened than what did, and of course this is precisely right. Second, there's a distinct emphasis on the aspect of fulfillment. The birth of Isaac came without surprise simply because that was what God had promised would happen. 4 times in 2 short verses, the element of fulfillment is stressed. As he had said, as he had promised, verse 1, and at the appointed time which God had spoken, verse 2. It was God who promised the child. It was God who accomplished his word, and this was done right on schedule. God's purposes are never delayed, nor are they ever defeated by man's sin. God's purposes are certain. What God has promised, he will accomplish, despite man's best efforts sometimes. Third, the son seems to be given almost more for Sarah's benefit here than for Abraham's. The Lord, Moses wrote, took note of Sarah and did for Sarah. Sarah wanted that son more than Abraham did. You'll remember that Abraham spoke to God on behalf of Ishmael, seeming to accept him as the son of promise. Neither did Abraham seem to take the promise of his son too seriously when he was willing to subject Sarah to the dangers of Abimelech's harem at the very time she was about to conceive the promised son. Even though Abraham may not have desired his child as much as his wife, God, faithful to his promises, God gave Abraham and Sarah a son. His response to the birth of Isaac might be described as dutiful. In obedience to instructions given him in Genesis 17, Abraham named the baby Isaac and circumcised him on the 8th day. Abraham thus followed God's instructions out to the letter perhaps without the joy that could have been experienced. We're reminded that Abraham was now 100 years old. In a way, Abraham and Sarah are more like grandparents to Isaac than parents. Who of us would have been overjoyed at the birth of a child at this age? When Abraham would have been drawing his pension for 35 years, he again became a parent. At the age of 113, he would enter the teenage years with his son. Sarah's ecstasy. Sarah declared, God has brought me laughter. All who hear about this will laugh with me. For who would have dreamed that I would ever have a baby? Yet I have given Abraham a son in his old age. If Abraham's response to the birth of his child is merely dutiful, Sarah is delirious. He named him Isaac, which means he laughed, as God had commanded him. Making a wordplay on her son's name, Sarah praised God for giving her cause to laugh, including that all who would hear about this miraculous birth will laugh with her. More than anything, their laughter was prompted by the absurdity of the thought of having a child so late in life. The name Isaac took on new significance. He was delight to his mother so late in her life. Isaac and Ishmael are contrasted. They have conflict and they have cooperation. The crisis with Ishmael, Abraham's lack of enthusiasm about his son Isaac, may seem very conjectural. We must admit this candidly. But the events of Genesis 21:8-21 certainly seem to strengthen this impression about Abraham's attitude towards his son. On the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham prepared a great feast. This seems to have provided occasion for celebration in those days. We should bear in mind the weaning of a child often occurred much later than it would today. Isaac could easily have been 3 or 4 years old or even older. On the day Isaac was weaned, Sarah saw Ishmael making fun of Isaac. Abraham, 100 years old when Isaac was born, Isaac circumcised on the 8th day. She didn't want Ishmael to be an heir with Isaac. Sarah asked Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away. While this displeased Abraham, God told him to do as Sarah wished, and Abraham obeyed. This part of the narrative completes the repetitive thread of the word laugh and laughter that began in Genesis 17:17 with Abraham's laughter, when God first promised him a son from Sarah. The thread of laughter that began continued through. The sight of Hagar's son at the feast robbed Sarah of all her joy that she would have had. By this time Ishmael would have entered his teens, who would likely have reflected his mother's disregard for Sarah and her son. The key to understanding this passage is in identifying what Sarah saw that so distressed her. What could it have been that would have caused God to allow Hagar and Ishmael to be sent away? This episode took place immediately after Isaac was weaned. How old was Isaac at this time? Ishmael was 13 years old when he was circumcised, 14 when Isaac was born, and as part of the family drama he would have been about 15 or 16 years old, near manhood. The literal translation Genesis 21:9 is that the 16-year-old was laughing with the 2 to 3 year old on the special day in which Isaac would be honoured by his father and the whole community. Some Bible scholars interpret laughter as mocking or malevolent, that Ishmael, like his mother who disdained Sarah, was ridiculing his brother. Isaac will become a Christ-like figure in chapter 22, and a connection will be made to Jesus' brothers, Jesus' Jewish kinsmen, laughing and scorning God's righteous son. Other scholars suggest something much more sinister. In ancient Near East literature, laughter can be a euphemism for the sexual foreplay or even the sexual act. This suggests that Ishmael was attempting to molest his brother, demeaning him to the community. This, they say, was an attempt to secure Isaac's place as the favoured son, just as Absalom took physical possession of his father's concubines in order to usurp his father's leadership. 2 Chronicles 36 verse 16 says, "They mocked the messengers of God and despised his words and misused his prophets until the wrath of the Lord arose against his people till there was no remedy." The RSV says playing implied that Sarah was insanely jealous. It's unfair. It should be translated mocking. This is an intense form of Isaac's name, verb to laugh. Its malicious sense here is demanded by the context and by Galatians 4:29, persecuted. Whatever the laughter pointed to, what did Sarah seem to identify as a danger to her son, and what was her solution to the problem? Notice Sarah never says Ishmael's name. She saw Hagar's teenage son as a danger to Isaac's position as the heir. Sarah's solution was to have Hagar and Ishmael expelled from the community. Galatians says, "But as he who was born according to the flesh, when persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, even so it is now. Nevertheless, what does the Scripture say? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. How out of character Sarah seems at this point. How different the description of her in Peter's letter is from that described by Moses. Let not your adornment be external only, braiding the hair, wearing gold jewellery, putting on dresses, but let it be the hidden personal heart with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of the Lord. For in this way in former times the holy women also, who hoped in God, used to adorn themselves, being submissive to their own husbands. Thus Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you have become her children if you do what is right, without being frightened by any fear. Sarah is obviously not at her best in chapter 21, but then again, neither is Abraham. Some have tried to applaud Sarah for her depth of spiritual insight concerning the fact that Isaac would be heir, not Ishmael. I think a primary motive was that of jealousy and a protective instinct to see that her son got what was coming to him. Sarah, like every Christian today, had moments she would just as soon forget entirely. This is surely one of these times for her. Peter's use of Sarah as an example of humility and submissiveness overlooks this event as an exception to the normal rule. In a similar fashion, the writer of the Hebrews spoke of Abraham and Sarah as those whose faith we should imitate. Their mistakes and sins were not mentioned because they were dealt with once and for all under the blood of Christ. Furthermore, their sins are not the point of the author's purpose in Hebrews, but rather their faith. Men's sins are recorded in Scripture in order to remind us that men and women of old were no different than we are, and to serve as a warning and instruction to us not to repeat their mistakes. Abraham was deeply grieved by the decision that would be enforced upon him. From chapter 17 we know he was very attached to his son Ishmael, and he would have been quite content for this child to be the heir through whom God's promises were fulfilled. This, however, was impossible because Ishmael was a result of human effort devoid of faith. The attachment of Abraham to his son Ishmael was so great that a crisis had to be reached before he would come to grips with the situation. While we cannot justify the motivation of Sarah for her ultimatum, such a move had to occur in order to force Abraham's hand in setting aside his aspirations for Ishmael. God reassures Abraham that as painful and unpleasant as the situation might be, putting Ishmael away was the right thing to do. In this instance, he should have listened to his wife. We should notice that it is both Hagar and the boy who are close to Abraham's heart. Up to now, Hagar had been referred to as Sarah's maid, but here she is called your maid by God. Sarah, we recall, was intentionally jealous of Hagar and of her son. It's impossible for a man to enter into an intimate relationship such as one Abraham had with Hagar and then simply walk away. Sarah knew this, and so did God. In more than just a physical way, Abraham had become one with Hagar, and Ishmael was the evidence of this union. In chapter 17:19, God had refused to accept Ishmael as the heir of Abraham. Isaac had insisted he would be heir of promise. It was therefore necessary for Ishmael to be sent away and forever eliminated from the status of an heir. Therefore Sarah's demands were to be met, and Ishmael was to be sent away. Yet the promises God had made to Hagar and to Abraham concerning Ishmael would be honoured. And of the son of the maid I will make a nation also, because he is your descendant. Hagar and Ishmael headed south into the wilderness of Beersheba. An angel appeared to Hagar and promised that Ishmael would become a great nation. Ishmael took a wife from Egypt and became an archer in the wilderness of Paran. The sending away of the son of a concubine was not without precedent in that day. In the Code of Hammurabi, Law 146, the children of slaves who had not made heirs must be set free as a compensation for this. Abraham's sending away of Ishmael fits very nicely into this practice. By giving him his freedom, he indicated that Ishmael had no part in his inheritance, which was kept exclusively for Isaac. Abram arose early to send off Hagar and Ishmael. While it sounds far less spiritual, surely an early start would be wise in the desert, since travel should be done in the cool of the day. An early departure would make it easier to say their goodbyes without the interference of Sarah. Abram would want to express his love for both Hagar and Ishmael without an audience. Some have suggested that Hagar lost her way in the desert, and this explains why she wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. Why did she not return to Egypt, as she seemed to be heading there when she first escaped from Sarai? Later she would take a wife for Ishmael from Egypt. Hagar possibly did not return to Egypt because she believed that God would fulfill his promise concerning Ishmael in the place where she chose to wander. So she sojourned in the desert wilderness, much like Abraham, trusting God to bless them there. Genesis 21:16 says, when the water was gone, she left the youth in the shade of a bush and went off and sat down 100 yards or so away. I don't want to watch him die, she said, and burst into tears, sobbing widely. The boy was no infant here, as might suppose, but a teenager, but he was nearly 14 years older than Isaac. Not wanting to see him die, Hagar left Ishmael some distance from her under what little shade the bushes would offer. Then she lifted up her voice and wept. It was not Hagar's cries that brought God's attention, but the boy's. As a descendant of Abraham, Ishmael was the object of God's special care. His cries brought divine intervention, and God heard the lad crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven. Then God opened Hagar's eyes, and she saw a well. She immediately filled her water container and gave the boy a drink. The solution to Hagar's problem was already present. Through her tears, she couldn't see the well close by. More than likely, it was not a distant structure, but simply a small source of water hidden among the bushes. God thus enabled her to see things as they really were, and Hagar and the boy were refreshed and revived. God's working in Hagar's life may seem harsh to us, but we understand his dealings to be such that his promises were accomplished. You remember that Ishmael was to be a wild ass of a man, hostile to his brothers, a free spirit. This kind of man could not be raised in a city with all its conveniences and advantages. Learning to survive in the desert, to prevail over hostile elements, was just what it took to make a man out of Ishmael. As basic training lays down the foundation to make a good soldier, so desert survival made a man of Ishmael. The two covenants in Galatians 24:21-31, the bondwoman, Hagar, Ishmael, born of flesh, Mount Sinai law, present Jerusalem, and children in slavery. The free woman, born through the promise, the law of the Spirit, free Jerusalem above, children of promise. He who is born according to the flesh persecuted him who is born according to the Spirit. So it has always been. Abraham and Abimelech, 21:22-23. Abimelech, king of Gerar, came to Abraham, a proposal of a covenant of Beersheba. Abraham remained in this land for a time. Problem over the well of water, the sheep, oxen, and 7 ewe lambs, calling on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God, at Beersheba. The life of Abraham. He left for out of Canaan, wandered in tents. There was a famine. He rescued Lot twice. He gave up Ishmael. A son of promise. Problems with Ishmael resolved. Peace with neighbours. No material worries. Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham. God told Abraham to go to the land of Moriah with Isaac, 2 young men, and wood for the offering, and offer Isaac as a burnt offering. 22 verse 1 and 2. This seems a bit of a shock. But Abraham obeyed God. He left the donkey with the 2 men, carried knife and fire as Isaac carried the wood for the altar. Isaac's question. Abraham built an altar and binds Isaac, stopped from slaying him by the angel of the Lord. Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to Abraham, and he said, here I am. Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah. Offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. As we first come to this command, we are struck by the obvious question, why is God doing this? What on earth is going on? What kind of God would command a man to engage in human sacrifice of his own son? To be fair, we must admit that the rest of the story is going to assure us that God doesn't permit Abraham to go through with his sacrifice. So the good thing is we know the end. But Abraham didn't. He will let him go right. God will let him go right up to the point of being about to kill his son, and then he will stop him. But why does God put Abraham through the agony and ordeal of such a preparation in the first place? Doesn't the New Testament assure us that God doesn't tempt people? Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself doesn't tempt anyone, James says. There is a subtle difference between being tested versus being tempted. The difference is in one of intention. Tempted, the intention is to make a person being tempted fail. Tested, the intention is to exercise the faith of the person being tested so it will be strengthened. When Satan tempts us, it's in order to make us fall. He does not have our best interests at heart. He has our worst interests at heart. It's a bit like having the Ford Corporation do testing of Toyotas. Their testing would likely be designed so that Toyotas would fail. Nissan checked the windscreens on imported cars. They set such a high standard that the imported cars couldn't be sold in Japan because they failed to meet the standard, thus giving Nissan an unfair trade advantage. On the other hand, a test that they carried out in their own vehicles would be likely designed so they may learn about their cars and improve their product. Abraham called it faith, promise of a seed, sojourn in Egypt and denial of Sarah, separates from Abraham, war in Sodom, covenant ceremony, Ishmael is born, covenant ceremony, destruction of Sodom, sojourn in Gerar, Ishmael separates from Abraham, Abraham's faith is tested. Here is another chiasm. So, God tests Abraham, and the test comes in a form that was appropriate to that age and culture. The idea of sacrifice of firstborn was not unique. There were other ancient religions that carried the same idea, especially in the case where a covenant had been broken. It is for this reason that Abraham doesn't respond to this command with a complaint that such an expectation is immoral or wrong. Abraham realizes something which they have generally lost sight of. God is the one who gives life, and all life is his. So God provides a test of Abraham. It's a test of his faith. The good news is that God has already provided amply to Abraham through his faith. The entire life of Abraham has been a story of faith. We have now come full circle to the final testing of Abraham's faith, that for which he has waited all his life, which has finally been given to him in his old age, is to be taken and given to the Lord. Back in Genesis 15:6, we are told that Abraham believed the Lord and was counted to him as righteousness. Now we see that faith resulted in a corresponding action on Abraham's part. Real faith always results in corresponding action. It is said if you go on a parachute jump out of a plane, the hardest part is taking the first step out of the door. After that, everything else is easy. Notice the action that takes place here. We don't read that Abraham procrastinated. It says he rose up early in the morning to prepare and began his journey to the place where God had commanded. Where was that place? It's described back in verse 2 as the land of Moriah. Where is the land of Moriah? The Bible gives the answer. Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David, at that place that David had prepared on the threshing floor of Onan the Jebusite. The place where Abraham was sent to sacrifice for his son was the same place where the temple was one David constructed. It was on the site of today's Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. On the third day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. And Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go yonder, and we will worship, and return to you." It took 3 days for Abraham and his party to arrive. As they finally get to the site where from a distance you can see the mountain, Abraham tells the servants who have come to him that they are to remain there. What is happening here? Abraham has not read the rest of Genesis 22. He doesn't have the hindsight that we have. What Abraham did have was faith. He believed the promise of God. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was offering up his own only begotten son. It was he to whom it was said, "In Isaac your descendants shall be called." He considered that God is able to raise men even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type. As Abraham and Isaac continued up the mountain, Isaac notices there is something missing from the supplies. They have come to make a burnt offering. Accordingly, they have a source of fire. They have the wood to burn. There's only one thing missing. It's a sacrifice. And so Isaac asks the obvious question: where is the sacrifice? It will be provided by God himself. There's a strange and prophetic quality to the words of Abraham, but it was in this same area 2,000 years later God provided the ultimate sacrifice for sins. Isaac to be offered as a sacrifice to God, Jesus offered as a sacrifice for the sins of the world. Isaac taken to Mount Moriah outside the ancient city of Jerusalem, Jesus taken to Golgotha outside the city of Jerusalem. Isaac carried the wood for the sacrifice up the mountain. Jesus carried a cross for his crucifixion to Golgotha. Isaac was bound and laid on an altar. Jesus was nailed to the cross. It took 3 days for the party to travel to Moriah, the place of death. 3 days after his crucifixion, Jesus rose from the dead. Abraham and Isaac finally arrive on the scene and go to work for preparing the sacrifice. The altar is built, the wood is arranged. Verse 9 says, "When they came to the place which God had told them, Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood and bound his son Isaac, laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son." The passage is strangely quiet about Isaac's response as he is taken and bound and placed upon the altar. He's strangely quiet because why would he allow himself to be bound and placed upon an altar? There must be something special happening here. Something, an awareness in Isaac's mind and thought that he trusts his father in this situation. Did Isaac protest? Did Abraham offer any explanation? Were there tears? We're not told. The reason we're not told is because that is not the big idea of the narrative. That's not the central issue. We're not meant to come here and look at Abraham's noble sacrifice or Isaac's submissiveness to his father. Those points are valid, but if you come here and see only those things, then you have missed the bigger idea of the passage. You're meant to come here and see God's substitute. Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and offer him here as a burnt offering. Seems to contradict God's promise. Calls upon Abraham to make a choice between God and Isaac. Abraham considered God is able to raise men even from the dead, the Hebrew writer had said. In Isaac your seed shall be called, that is, for those who are the children of flesh. These are not the children of God, but the children of promise are counted as seed. For this is the word of promise. At this time I will come to Sarah, shall have a son. Imagine the scene. Isaac lies bound upon the altar. The wood is ready. The knife is sharp. The intended sacrifice is ready to be put to death. Abraham raises the instrument of death. Suddenly, there is an interruption. Abraham's purpose was to slay Isaac, and the omniscient God of heaven knew that Abraham had figuratively already slain Isaac in his mind. That was good enough for God. And so he restrained Abraham from going to the end of the awful trial. The Lord said, "For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." The fear of God here is defined as perfect obedience to God's will. If Abraham would not have gone through the trial, his disobedience would have been recognized as a lack of fear or lack of respect for God. Solomon said the fear of God is the beginning of knowledge, but the foolish despise wisdom and instruction. It was a lack of fear or respect for God that caused Judah to sin against the Lord. A true respect and faith in Yahweh God will move the faithful to follow his commands. What would you have done if you had been there? Fear and faith are two of a kind in acceptable service to the Lord. Abraham had selflessly obeyed God's command in this intense trial, and so displayed the obedient character of Jesus. When Jesus stared death in the face, he said to Heavenly Father, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Abraham has passed the test of faithfulness. Notice what it said, "You have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." This is not a denial of the existence of Ishmael, but it is to say that Isaac was a special son, a son of promise. Because Abraham had not withheld the sacrifice of his son, his only son, God knows that Abraham fears him and honors him and loves him. The good news is that what God has called us to do, he also has done himself. God has not withheld his son, his only son, from us. Because God passed the faithfulness test, we can trust him, and we can trust in his love. Then Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, a ram caught in the thicket by his thorns. Abraham went, took the ram, and offered him up for the burnt offering in the place of his son. And Abraham called the name of that place, "The Lord will provide." As it is said to this day, "In the mount of the Lord it will be provided." Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket, a substitute. He understands that this substitute is to take the place of his son, and so Isaac is released and the ram is sacrificed in his place. Genesis 1:4, "And God saw the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness." Genesis 3:6, "When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, there was a delight to the eyes." Genesis 12, "Now the Lord, go forth from your country, from your relatives, and from your father's house to land which I will show you," literally, "which I will cause you to see." 1 Samuel 16:7, "God sees not as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." That brings us to the obvious question, what was it that Abraham saw? Verse 13 says that Abraham raised his eyes and looked. The word translated looked is ra. Same word translated provided in the next verse. To see, to discern, to look, to perceive. He looked, and behold, Yahweh will provide. The same words. What did Abraham see? What did God say would be seen? We need to look at what the Lord will look at and what Abraham looked at. It was a ram. He lifted up his eyes. He looked at the ram. It was a ram that had been provided by God. It was a ram that was to serve as a substitute for Isaac. Abraham looked and saw the ram. He didn't name the place. Abraham looked. Instead, named it, "The Lord will look, provide." Abraham called the name of that place Jehovah Jireh, that is to say, to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. You see the significance? Abraham looks at the picture of the ram, and Abraham understands the truth about the future. It's a truth that God is one day going to provide a substitute who will die in our place. That God will look at that substitutionary sacrifice and he will be satisfied. Why is that so significant? It's significant because rams and lambs and animal sacrifices do not do anything to satisfy sin. The blood of an animal cannot turn a wrong into a right. But the death of God's promised Saviour was able to do what no animal could ever do. God came to do what no sacrifice could ever do. When the blood of goats and bulls and rams and sheep were insufficient, God provided himself as a sacrifice. The cross was the ultimate act of love. It was given so that we might see, but it was also given so that God himself could see. Isaiah makes mention of this in Isaiah 53. As a result of the anguish of his soul, he will see it and be satisfied. By his knowledge, the righteous one, my servant, will justify the many, as he will bear their iniquities. This is the same reward. It points to the fact that the cross was a place where the Father looked upon the Son, the righteous one, and was satisfied that the penalty for sin had been paid in full. Justice was satisfied when God the judge became God the judged. C.S. Lewis used to say that unbelievers tend to think that they can put God in the dock. That's an old English saying for putting something on trial. In English court, the accused would stand on a raised platform to be judged, and the platform was known as the dock. Lewis pointed out that we, as the handiwork of the Creator of all things, have no right or ability to put God in the dock. It is we who are in danger of being judged. Yet, God put himself in the place of judgment in the person of Jesus Christ, the righteous one. Not only that, he was judged to be guilty not because of any sins he had committed. He was identified with our sins and was judged in our place. God looked upon Jesus and was satisfied. What is to be our response? Much the same. We are called to look to Jesus. Therefore, since there is so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Look to Jesus. Fix your eyes upon him. Are you tired? Look to Jesus and he will give you strength. Are you depressed? Look to Jesus. Are you lonely? Look to the one who loves you and gave himself for you. Are you overcome with guilt, knowing you have not measured up before God and despairing that you can never return? Look, 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 and know that God himself has looked and has been satisfied. Our God is faithful. I would make a nation. I will give you a seed. I will give you this land. Summary: God tests Abraham. When Abraham was 100 and Sarah 90, Isaac, the child of promise, was born. When Isaac was a lad old enough to carry the wood for sacrifice up Mount Moriah, the Lord God tested Abraham by commanding him to offer his darling son, the object of all his hope and the dearest thing to earth on him, as a burnt offering. The Lord demanded no more of Abraham than he himself later did for you and me. When Abraham obeyed, the angel of the Lord stopped the aged, faithful patriarch just as he was poised to plunge a knife into his precious Son. Then God added his oath by his own name, the highest name by which he could swear, to the promise and the covenant, and repeated the nation and seed promise. The threefold promise now had threefold divine assurance. The promise, the covenant, the oath of the Lord of God, who cannot lie. Many Bible teachers call this promise to Abraham an unconditional promise. But there was nothing unconditional about it. Abraham had to leave his home and family. He had to go where the Lord would direct him. Walk before the Lord. Abraham had to walk before the Lord, living in recognition he was in the presence of God. Abraham had to strive to be blameless before God. Abraham had to be circumcised at the age of 99 and circumcise all the males of his house. Abraham's command to his children, his household after him, that they keep the way of the Lord and do righteousness and justice, as a call to a lifestyle, a commitment to God. Offer his beloved Son of promise as a burnt offering. Conditional. Abraham could do nothing. Abraham did nothing. Ridiculous. How would you like to have to keep all those conditions? Circumcision of all males as a sign of the covenant became a condition to all succeeding generations. These verses should be enough to convince our faith-only friends of the necessity of obedience to a recipient of God's promise. God reiterates a promise that he initially made to Abraham in Genesis 12 and again in Genesis 15 due to the fact that the promise remained intact. I will do this because Abraham listened to me and obeyed all my requirements, commandments, regulations and laws. Genesis 26 verse 5 says. Abraham's faithful obedience caused the Lord to reiterate the promise to Abraham by the formula, because you have obeyed my voice. Yahweh swore by his own name that surely his blessings he has promised Abraham would be due to his obedience. In Hebrews 6:13. That which was dearest to Abraham in his life, Isaac, his only son of promise, was not placed before Yahweh God and his commandments. He was willing to give up his son. God was the zenith of Abraham's interest because he knew that his relationship with God was far more important than any earthly object. Abraham goes from deceiving Abimelech and handing over his wife in cowardice to perfect obedience to God's will. Paul describes the struggle of trying to do the things we know to be right. We often fail due to weakness of the flesh. The mark of the true disciple of Christ is the ability to rebound from sin, repenting of it, asking the Lord's forgiveness in humble submission. Now I know you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me, offering up the ram in the thicket, whom the Lord will provide. Reiteration of the promise: greatly bless you, greatly multiply you. Seed shall possess the gate of the enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Blessed I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, as the sands which is on the seashore. Your descendants shall possess the gate of your enemies. In your seed all the nations of the enemies of the earth shall be blessed. Why? Because you have obeyed my voice. God offering his son Jesus. Jesus giving his life on the cross. Abraham's sacrifice was a type. The resurrection from the dead. Redemption of the firstborn after Exodus. The role of obedience in our justification, James says. God's testing is not temptation. Tests come when we are prepared. Tests are difficult, but they're for our own good. Tests can be unexpected. Tests often seem illogical to us. Tests help us to grow where we need to grow. They demonstrate our weakness and then they demonstrate our strength. Abraham received news concerning his brother's family in 22:20-24. Milcah, Abraham's niece, has borne children to Nahor. 8 sons of Milcah and 4 sons of his concubine are mentioned. One of Milcah's sons stands out, Bethuel, the father of Rebekah. Genesis 22:19-20. So Abraham returned unto his young men, and they rose up and went together to Beersheba. Abraham dwelt at Beersheba. And it came to pass after these things that it was told Abraham, saying, Behold, Milcah, she also hath borne children to your brother Nahor. Genesis 22:21-23. Uz, the firstborn, and Buz his brother, and Kemuel the father of Aram, and Chesed, and Hazo, and Pilshas, and Jilzbah, and Bethuel. And Bethuel begat Rebekah. Genesis 22:24. These 8 did Milcah bear to Nahor, Abraham's brother, and his concubine, whose name was Reumah. She also bare Tebah, Gaham, Tahash, and Maacah. Abraham's brother Nahor also had 12 sons, like Jacob and Ishmael. If you got something out of this passage, then please feel free to come back and join us again as we continue our study.